In this video, we're going to talk about some basic steps of organization design. It may not make you an expert totally by the end, but you're probably going to be able to have smarter conversations. That's coming up right now. Hi there, I'm Andrea Adams, the host of HR Shop Talk. On the show, you get expert insight into anything that has to do with HR. I encourage you to subscribe to the show or podcast to keep learning from my guests. Today, my guest is again Len Nanjad. Len is an expert in organizational design. As far as I can tell, it's his thing. We've already done an episode together, and that was super fascinating. And I came across him when I was at a conference. Hi, Len, how are you?
I'm fantastic, thanks. Great to see you again, Andrea.
Yeah, you too. And I hope this one is just as smart as the last one. So let's say I'm the owner of a medium-sized business and I come to you and I say, things just aren't working. I think I need to redesign my organization. How do you approach that? What do you do?
It's an interesting question. I do get it all the time. I guess my response to that question, should someone come to that, is, exactly returning the question, well, why do you think that?
Mm-hmm.
What are you experiencing that makes you think that it's organizational design?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's probably the starting point, which leads into an assessment. And there's, I would call it, 3 levels of depth of assessment. There's kind of that initial conversational, symptomatic one that I just talked about. So, what are you experiencing? What are the things that make you think that it's your structure that's that problem?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because what we want to do in that first conversation is to remove a little bit of bias, to say, well, is it the structure or is it just you want to get rid of somebody? And so just understanding what they're experiencing, what their motivation is for it. The second level of assessment is just a little bit more structured, and I can provide you with like a quick self-check 10-point questionnaire that really points at some symptoms that if you answer yes to, it's an indication of some misalignment of your organization. Things like, are you experiencing missteps in organization direction? Have you tried a couple of things and they failed and you've had to go back and revisit? Are you finding increasing difficulty or slowness of decision making? Are you finding that some managers are doing far too much of their team's work? Is there micromanaging happening? And so questions like that we can put into quite a nice, neat package, and just, again, it becomes a conversation with the leader to say, okay, that really is a conversation spark, right? And then you can get the third type of assessment, which is just a more in-depth, formalized organizational assessment. And that's where you would have a much more structured approach around collecting information, doing interviews based on a very specific set of questions that look around the framework of understanding your strategy, understanding your organizational systems and processes, your current structure definition already, as well as looking at your management systems. We've talked about that in the last session, like how you actually manage the work and manage the structure itself, and your governance. So there's a framework of factors that we can then analyze, and your culture, of course. So just getting a sense of what your culture is, because that can shape your structure as well. So all of these things form a much more structured, formalized assessment that can be then looked at through the documents you have, through interviews and or surveys, and even going so far as to observe what's actually going on as the work is getting done, right? And so that speaks to the validity of the information, right? There's what you say you do,
right?
What you write down what you do, and what you actually do.
Right.
So those data points then come into an observation of what is happening with your organization and what are the indicators of organizational misalignment. And once you have the indicators of organizational misalignment, you can then get into the next steps of redesign.
Right. Okay. So that segues perfectly into my next question. What are the steps after assessment? What are the steps in org design?
So I guess I'd back into the assessment piece a little bit, because the steps kind of look like this. First, you need to be clear about the strategy that's guiding your structure. Some would say the first step is actually understanding the culture because of this concept that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I would say they're equal. Culture is strategy, strategy is culture. So you need to look at both strategy and culture as pieces of alignment.
Can I interrupt here? You talk about the strategy around structure. I think you said something like that anyway. How do you go about understanding what that is?
Well, no, the business strategy, the organizational strategy itself. So what are your
whatever it is they're trying to achieve with their organization.
Right,
Okay.
right. So my shorthand for that is, again, a lot of organizations are saying, I don't have a strategy, don't believe in strategy, don't care about strategy. We're not organized for strategy. And I'm like, yes, you are. Because you need four things. You need goals, a unique value proposition. Basically, how are you competing and winning business in your marketplace? Or how are you generating value if it's public sector or not for profit? It's still, what is your unique value proposition? And therefore that relates to what are your core activities? What are the core things you have to do to generate that? Mm-hmm. And the starting point too is like, what is your product market focus? Who do you focus on as a client or a customer or a service base? And what is it that you're offering to them in terms of a service or product? So those four things at a minimum are your strategy.
Okay. Anyways, that was fascinating, but I derailed us a little bit. You were talking about the steps of org design and have been talking about,
No, but that's a step. So understanding the strategy a little bit better, clarifying the culture within the strategy that it operates. Then another step that goes is you translate the strategy into what's called an operating model, right? So you've got some core high-level processes or what some would call a value chain. What are all the steps from taking your inputs to creating an output of value, right? And so that's the work. That actually helps clarify what the work is. And then there's other components of operating in terms of who are the people or organizations that you interact with that are suppliers or partners. Where are you based in terms of location and customer that you deliver to? All these things that shape how you actually get the work done is also a basis of understanding that needs to be clarified, right? Before you even get to lines and boxes, we're not there yet. So now what we've done is we've taken an assessment of the current state. We've understood the strategy, the culture, the operating model.
Yeah.
The next step then is to say, okay, so if we understand all of those things, now we get to sketching and sketching organizational design options. That's the step that says, okay, so we could realign this way to achieve the strategy and deliver on the operating model. Mm-hmm. Or we could realign our groupings this way to get the same outcomes. When you do that, there's actually a step that I missed, which is called setting up decision criteria or design criteria.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Right? Yeah. Because the ultimate purpose of organization design is to make a decision about how you're going to structure the work. So you have to overlay or underlay this with a decision-making method. So the decision-making method is basically, once you understand all the things you need to align with, then come to agreement on what your decision-making criteria are. Is this going to be more expensive or less expensive? Well, we have to be revenue neutral or cost neutral to what we are today. Okay, well, that's a criteria, right? Are we going to add or subtract people? Well, actually, it doesn't matter. We just have to do the right things. Well, then that's not a criteria. Okay, so don't make it a conversation piece, right? So you go through this list of things that it should be doing, right? Like if your strategy says we need to become more customer focused, well, then does your structure encourage and enable much more customer focus or not? Right? Which has implications for your structure that says, oh, well, maybe we should have a VP of customer, or maybe there should be a group called Voice of the Customer that focuses on that, because that would enable the strategy for us to listen to our customer better, right? So these things have to come into your decision criteria. When you have those listed, then you get into defining different structural options. And then you get back to, okay, well, which of the options is the best one? Well, we go back to our decision criteria and evaluate them against the decision criteria, which ultimately you'll come up with one that is a preferred option. And once you have one that's a preferred option, you can then dive into that into a little bit more depth into position profiles, job descriptions, relationships, interconnections, and you can flesh out that design a little bit more. And then you're done the design process, and then you can move on to the implementation process.
Well, that's, I guess, my next question then. What does implementation look like?
So a good way to really structure it simply in mind is there's probably three layers or three elements to implementation. First is the definition of the new redesigned positions and putting those into effect. So what's the new jobs that we have to put into effect? Okay, do those have to go into an HRIS? Right? Do those have to be job evaluated and leveled and compensation leveled and all those good things? So there's just the design itself has to be implemented in terms of the positions and getting those positions into our system of managing positions and relationships with those positions.
Right.
The second layer of implementation is adding people into those positions.
Yep.
Right. So doing the talent mapping, talent evaluation, talent selection, hiring that you need to do to get a person matched to positions. And then the third part, which is very closely related, is transition into operating into those positions. So, okay, Andrea, I've selected you to become the new vice president of digital HR.
Okay.
Awesome. When do I start? Monday. Okay. But I need to get trained on what digital HR means. Oh, yeah. So maybe that's your first week of work is going to that training. So developing a transition plan in terms of what is it that that person needs to be ready to start in the role, or their onboarding plan or their first 90-day plan in order to be transitioning into that role to be as effective as they can in that new role as quickly as possible.
If you found this interesting, subscribe to see all the episodes and comment. Have you ever been involved in an organization design that went badly, or maybe it went well? What aspect of that process worked well or didn't? Let us know in the comment section. All right. So are there organization design types? I know I referred to one in our last episode. It was the matrix organization. And then there's what I've previously described as a hierarchical organization. But is there other types?
Yeah, there are many, many types, or what we would call forms of structure.
Forms, okay.
And it's really based on what is the principle or logic you're using to group the work.
Okay.
So the first and foremost, the most basic type, the most common type that we do is called a functional organizational structure. The principle there is grouping work that is similar in nature.
Finance, HR, operations.
Yeah. So those are typically functional departments.
Okay.
Right. And then everything kind of goes from there. So then you could have what's called a divisional structure. So a divisional structure has all of those functions, but in different business units. So we have our toy division, we have our amenities division, we have our entertainment division. Right. So these are different products and services that each have their own functions. It's designed specifically for that unit of operation, whether it be a product or service, or even a region. Then there's the matrix. So you combine those two together and go, okay, so what's the set of functions or services we provide against the set of divisions or organizational units, whether that be geographical. In the case of oil and gas, as an example, it could be by asset type. In the case of consumer business, it just could be by region or customer, or it could be by customer type. Another form of organization could be project-based, right? Teams come together based on a project, and then they disband as a project is finished. The inverse of that is also true. You could have a team-based structure. Teams stay intact, and they move from project to project to project to project. And then there's networked organizations where that's all fluid. You just bring people together in different ways of how things are connected. Those are harder to manage, but they're just different to manage. I shouldn't say harder, because we just don't have enough common experience in them. It just seems difficult, but they're actually quite different. That's all. And then there's even fully autonomous organizational forms where they just form on their own and disband on their own to solve a problem.
Within an organization? I mean, that
Not
like,
necessarily within an organization. They actually come from an ecosystem of people,
huh.
and that's sort of the next wave, leading edge. But if you think about different business models where there's a product based way of making money, then there's a platform based way of making money, which is kind of like creating a market where you match buyers and sellers. That's essentially what a platform is, right? And then you move to an ecosystem form of making money, which is a set of different platforms all connected to each other. That's a different business model, which creates a different operating model, which can create a more ecosystem based way of organizing.
Can I ask you a question?
Go
Is there
ahead.
one of them you really, for the most part, dislike?
I just like the Matrix the most.
Oh, interesting.
Um,
Why?
well, and it's interesting to say that because in my career, personally, I spent most of my career in matrixed organizations. So I'm
Yeah.
not saying that they don't have function. I think that the most misunderstood and misused form of organizational structure is the matrix. I think by definition, the matrix tries to imply that you have two bosses. You have your service boss, and then you have your
functional,
not functional. So your product boss, right? So
right.
if,
Yep.
and so then you have two bosses, and that doesn't really work well in natural human systems. You need one accountable leader, right? And so is the organization authority really coming from the project or the asset or the geography or the customer line or whatever the function is, right? So is HR really a community of practice and a center of excellence, or is it the center of authority of how to get things done, right? And so clarifying that authority and that accountability in the matrix is where I spent a lot of time with organizations, actually helping them to clarify accountability, clarify roles, clarify decision making as a result of that. And that form can be very successful if you're clear about accountability and roles. So I'm not knocking it as a bad form. It's just that the most often kind of misinterpreted and misused form because of this idea that, well, it's okay to have two bosses, and it might be okay, but it's not effective.
Right. Yeah. I can see why that would be. Okay. So what do you say, do leaders or HR get wrong most often about org design?
Ooh, that's well, I mean, I can probably reframe that question.
Okay, go ahead. By all means. I'm down.
I don't know if it's a matter of right or wrong. I think it's just a matter of what we know and what we don't know.
Okay.
And so I think that a wise thing to do is actually to investigate what are key principles of human systems and key principles of organizational design that makes them effective, right? And you would say, okay, well, that's just an education piece. But I think that a lot of leaders go with organizational design from the hip. They're like, well, I've been in organizations for 30 years. I've seen it organized this way, that way, this way. I know what works. We're just going to go off and do it. And it's like, well, if you still haven't learned some of the core principles of organizational design, human dynamics science, systemic design, systems thinking, you're just doing stuff based on what people have done before. And what people have done before is based on what they knew before. And what they knew before may not be up to date. So I think there's just definitely value in understanding what organizational systems are and mean and what makes them effective. Like that principle of complexity that I talked about. Like that is so pervasive. That's probably the single most powerful thing in my practice that I think about, which is what is the complexity of work here? What are the layers of complexity of work? And I can be quite objective about that. I can ask about that. I can find evidence for that. And I can understand if you have layers of management that are too close together or layers of management that are too far apart that are creating the symptoms that you're experiencing. And then I can realign to say, well, we need to either get rid of a layer of management here, or I need to add a layer of management here because these positions are too far apart and needs a translating layer between it. So just being clear about those kinds of principles are really important. And that's something that is often missed. I don't think it's wrong, but I think it's often missed. I think We talked about in our last episode as well, just, what do I think about designing for a person? And I was quite direct in saying that is probably a mistake. That is something that we often find it very hard in the organizational design process that I described, how to get it done. You're always thinking about, well, what about James, or what about Susan, or what about Henry?
Yes, we are.
Like, how are they going to fit into all of this once we all get it all done?
Right.
And you really do have to separate the people from the design of the work that you're trying to get done, and then you adapt. I know there are other schools of thought that think about, well, if it's about human systems and human thriving, like you say, Len, then shouldn't we just be designing systems based on the people? And the answer is no. People have many purposes, many desires, many capabilities. When you bring groups of people together to get work done, it becomes a collective system design thing. And senior leaders need to understand the principles of systems design in order to have effective human systems to do those people that best service. You can't just let them do what is individually best for them, because it won't connect collectively, in my view and in my experience.
Okay. Final question here, and probably and possibly one of the most important ones is, if someone wants to learn more about org design, what do you suggest?
So what do I suggest? There's some great sources of material out there that are fast, simple, easy to consume, and powerful. So if I can throw out a couple of quick terms here.
For sure, yeah.
Andrew Campbell is a great source of understanding the operating model. Accountability-based management is a term you can look up, and that can actually help you understand getting clear about accountabilities and role design and complexity of work. Another place you could learn from, again, from Andrew Campbell as well, he has authored a great classic article now about what are the 9 tests of good organizational design. That gives you a great start point for understanding those decision criteria I talked about, as well as what is good practice of organizational alignment. So those are just some places to start and read. Don't take my word for it. There's many other experts that I'm standing on the shoulders of. But I guess being self-serving, you can just call me or email me.
Sure. I'll add your LinkedIn URL to the description of the episode so that they can reach out to you.
That said, maybe if I could add one last shameless plug, I'd say there's also a number of good video courses out there that you can take. You can get these concepts in an hour through some video courses. So there are many out there, and I have one published out on Udemy as well. Even LinkedIn Learning has a very good organizational design foundation type material there that you can learn in a couple of hours, some of the basics. So lots of good places to learn more. But yeah, I think it's often just call an expert.
Thanks, Len. I feel actually quite a bit smarter than I did before. Len and I also did an episode on the principles of organization design, and that link is right here. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.